Our second speaker today is Dr. John B. Cobb, Jr. He is founding director of the Center for Process Studies and professor emeritus at Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University. He is the author of over 300 published articles and 30 books. He has edited 10 books. Some of the recent titles of John Cobb are Transforming Christianity and the World, The Earthist Challenge to Economism, a Theological Critique of the World Bank, Progressive Christians Speak, which he edited for the Mobilization for the Human Family, and most recently, Postmodernism and Public Policy, Reframing Religion, Culture, Education, Sexuality, Class, Race, Politics, and the Economy. His topic for today is Imperialism in American Economic Policy. Would you welcome Dr. John B. Cobb, Jr.
Thank you, John. I'm really extremely pleased by this opportunity. It's a new one, so what you'll be hearing today is not the same speech I've made frequently before, but an effort to look at things in a somewhat different way. I have for 20 years or more been talking a lot about the economy and trying to show the way in which economic theory has become the basic theology of the world. And then I've been trying to work at the job of undercutting the commitment to that theory as an adequate grounds for overall social, political, economic policy. I want to say I'm going to make some critical comments about economic theory today. I'm not going to go into it in detail. I think there are some problems with economic theory even within narrow province in which it's properly used. My main complaint is that economic theory has been taken out of that limited province, and the rest of our social lives have been subordinated to the goals that belong to economic theory. In other words, instead of having the economy embedded in the society, which is of course also embedded in the wider ecological context, we have tried to make the economy the overall context, and education is for the sake of the economy, government is for the sake of the economy. Sometimes religion is for the sake of the economy, and so forth and so on. So it's when it becomes the dominant ideology for the whole culture that I think it becomes very important to ask, are its assumptions adequate and correct? Well, that's a kind of point I've been making for some time. It seems to me very important to remove from the policies that follow from economic theory the aura of moral justification that they have assumed and have succeeded in persuading a lot of people of. Even after we've done that, we still have the problem of power. But what distresses me is that so many people of goodwill, so many Christians, including Christian ethicists, have accepted the idea that the way forward for society as a whole is read off of an economic theory, which has no place for community, no place for justice, no place for the natural world. It is, I think, then not surprising that the results of building our policies on that theory have been immensely destructive for human communities everywhere, have led to extremely unjust distribution of the goods of the earth, and have been extremely destructive of the natural world. Okay, now that's a speech I've been making for a long time. So I'm not going to make it again today. I have recognized the importance of power. I have not supposed that if we can undercut the ring of truth and morality about that policy, and thus remove from it the support of people who are genuinely people of goodwill concerned about overcoming poverty in the world, and so forth and so on, that suddenly those policies will collapse. Those same policies that are justified on these moral and intellectual grounds, which I think are weak and can be shown to be weak, are also supported by transnational corporations and governments and the elites that do benefit from the application of those policies. Nevertheless, driving that wedge has seemed to me to be important, and I will talk more about that tomorrow, because I think to some extent that wedge has been driven between these two, and the present situation is very different from the one 20 years ago when I began. But now, in the last couple of years, I've been making far more speeches about American empire, or up until the time that the defenders of the present policies began using the term, I preferred to try to use their language and talk about global dominance, global hegemony, Pax Americana, and other such terms. But of course, they all amount to the same thing. It means the US will control what happens in the world, and I think using the term empire is now entirely appropriate. I think we need now not to argue about whether we have empire, but what to do about the fact that we have empire. So that's the direction I want to go. Now, believing as I do that the economy is immensely important, I'm going to focus on the economic developments, but now looking at those economic developments not simply as the working out by conscientious people of the implications of a particular theory, which is what I have primarily focused on before, but the ways in which the economy has become a useful tool through which American imperialism has operated. So I don't think it conflicts with or contradicts the other points, but it certainly puts the last 50 years in a somewhat different light, one that I had not been seeing it in until very recently. I confess my personal indebtedness to the present administration. And I think that this is not only I, but many of us have come to understand what our country has been doing for a long time because of the directness with which the neoconservatives express these goals and advocate them. It's no longer mysterious. We don't have to grope around to find these hidden meanings in what is going on. They're no longer hidden at all. Okay. Now, I'll go back to the years beginning at the end of the Second World War. Obviously, we can trace American imperialism much farther back than that, but this is the period that I've been focusing on in terms of my economic reflections. And of course, at the end of the war, two types of international institutions were created. One of them was the United Nations, and the other were the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, in the creation of both of these, the United States certainly made it clear, there was nothing hidden about this, that it planned to be top dog. In the United Nations, this of course expressed itself in the veto that David was talking about, but in many other ways it was clear that the United States would not be just one of the five powers with veto, but would be the most important power. The economic lever was a very important one. Nevertheless, it expressed more than sheer imperialism. It expressed the view that it would be possible to have an improved international order over against the one that had been present before. It expressed some regret at not having participated in the League of Nations, some recognition that that was a mistake for the United States, may have had some responsibility for World War II, and so forth and so on. There was some idealism mixed with the realism and imperialism of the time. But it would not come quickly to one's mind to say, this was an imperialistic gesture, though certainly the dominance of the United States was important. At Bretton Woods, I would say similarly, the interests of the United States were perhaps more blatant, in the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions. It was clear that the IMF and the World Bank would be located in Washington, D.C. It was clear that the United States would have by far the loudest and strongest voice, that they would be normally headed by Americans, at least in the case of the World Bank. So, again, American dominance was never questioned. But at that point, most of the rest of the world, prostrate as it was not unhappy about the fact that the United States would take the lead. So you didn't have so much in that respect the feeling of cramming something down reluctant throats. Now, there was one thing that happened which points more clearly in the direction of American imperial interests. Of course, this is mainly commercial imperial interest, and that is that it became an occasion for ending the self-enclosedness of the British Empire. The United States made it very clear that Britain would no longer be able to have an empire within which it could trade and have the control of investments and so forth. The United States wanted access to that, and it got it. So that's but you could say that was a counter-imperialist move. It was a nail in the coffin of the British Empire, and the idea was that these countries would be treated just the way all other countries were treated, not have these special relationships with Great Britain. So, again, I think the term imperialism, while retroactively looking back, we can see something like that at work here, is not clearly applicable to what was going on in those cases. So, at least at that point, the American people were ready for multilateral global activity, with the U.S. at least as first among equals, maybe first without any equals. I'm not quite sure how to word that. But nevertheless, with some respect for the autonomy and the independent activities, or at least the voices of other people. Just as the United Nations came into being partly because people didn't want to go through another world war, the IMF institutions came into being because people didn't want to go through another depression. And of course that was to American interest, but at that point, American interest and the interests of many, many other people in the world seemed to have a certain kind of convergence, and so the issue of motive didn't seem to be too important. Also, I think the war brought longer-term thinking. David was talking about how dominated we are today by bottom line 6 months from now and in very short term. I think at the end of a terrible war, many people want to think about the next generation and not just the next year or two, and that this had some effect upon what went on. Now, my argument is that whereas at the time, relatively few people in this country paid much attention to what went on at Bretton Woods. It seemed very technical, very obscure. Well, it's just that stuff those economists do. It was what went on in San Francisco that generated excitement. And perhaps for some years, the United Nations was a more important institution than the Bretton Woods institutions. But as we will see a little later on, power was shifted from the United Nations to the Bretton Woods institutions, and they have become by far the more powerful institutions in shaping what goes on in the world. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, after September 11th, we can view also what happened from the period of from the end of World War II to around 1980 in somewhat different ways. Yet even through that period, the imperialist thrust, though certainly you can detect it in many different places, was checked and muted. Now, this was probably more because of the Cold War than any other one thing. We did not want to be the only country in the world opposing the Soviet Union. We wanted the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, to be on our side. And it was very important that in order to successfully oppose the Soviet Union as a powerful nation, but also to oppose communism, which of course then would ally itself with the Soviet Union, that the New Deal be allowed to continue to work in American society. There was internal to the United States considerable power sharing. The economic theory that operated was more Keynesian than neoliberal. And Keynesianism, though I'm no expert on sorting out these similarities and differences, has a bit more of the political economy flavor to it. That is, the economic concerns are not as radically separated from political and social concerns in the thought of Keynes as it came to be in the later development of economics. So we actually had a period in this country in which unions did pretty well, labor was rather powerful, wages rose, and a structure of taxation that actually did tax the rich a little bit more than the poor was implemented. And we moved, of course, not nearly as far as the Europeans, but still some distance in the direction of guaranteeing minimum support to all the citizens of the country. So these moves, as we look back retroactively, we can see that they were allowed primarily because it was important not to allow communism or Marxist sympathy to gain a foothold within our country. I say we can see it looking back because once the threat was removed, immediately things changed. So I think that shows that the imperialists, if we want to use this term, recognized the importance of having almost unanimous support for the actions of the United States against communism and against the Soviet Union within the country, which meant that the benefits of prosperity had to be widely shared. And also they needed to have the support of other countries that were relatively healthy. Our support of the Marshall Plan, I think, had some real idealism in it. And it also was very good for some economic sectors in our country. But of course it was also part of Cold War strategy. If Western Europe had remained in miserable condition for 20 years, it probably would have gone communist. And that would have been a great blow to the desire of the United States to be on the dominating side, end of the spectrum. Now, with respect to the Third World, also, the Cold War made a huge difference. And again, we can see changes in U.S. policy when the Cold War ceased to be such an important factor. The rhetoric of our country and its actions to a smaller extent expressed real interest in Third World development. And the general view was that each of the Third World countries could decide, with the help of, say, World Bank advisors and so forth, how to go about developing. In other words, the general model was that of national economies, engaged, of course, in international trade, but nevertheless able to make the basic decisions about how to order their own internal affairs and their own internal economies. Some countries did very well with this, others did not do well at all. And there was a kind of double development. On the one hand, in spite of the fact that we would lend money and give money, and the World Bank would invest in making all kinds of projects, and other banks did the same thing, the development that took place in most countries benefited the elites and not the masses of people. Some of this, I think, is unintended consequences. I mean, I do believe that many of the people in the World Bank, including McNamara, really did want to reduce poverty. They said they did, and sometimes they massively seem to engage in efforts to do that. But when you tried to reduce poverty by building dams, and that was the favorite mode of development as far as the World Bank was concerned, you create a lot of poverty. And the people who can get control of the water and the electricity are not the ordinary peasants. They are the elites of the countries into which you move. So I think generally unintended consequence was that the gap between the poor and the rich in third world countries grew. But the most important political goal of the United States was to have the support of third world elites, since they were the ones who determined which side of the Cold War their countries would be on and whether the goods that they produced would be available in the first world. So I don't think it bothered those who we will now call the imperialists in our government that the poor were getting poorer, as long as the elites were satisfied with the type of development that was taking place in their countries, and we were willing to invest, to give, to lend, in order to make those kinds of changes possible. But even the third world elites were not as satisfied as we wanted them to be. They felt that the terms of trade, which made probably more difference in their economies than these gifts and loans from the banks and the first world countries, were more and more destructive to their economies. That is, they mostly produced commodities and they imported machinery and other high-tech stuff. And the price of what they imported went up and the price of what they exported went down, so that they were becoming impoverished even if the elites were doing relatively well. So a very important development in this period, especially in the 70s, was the emergence of, well, beginning in the 60s already, of third world governments getting together, trying to create an alternative voice in the total situation, which was not supporting the first world against the second world or the second world against the first world, but was saying a plague on both your houses. What we want is fair trade, give us a chance to have our own economic development. And this voice was being heard quite effectively within the United Nations Assembly. And some of the organizations of the United Nations were very sympathetic to it, and it seemed to be moving toward a position of importance that could not be neglected. Now, the third world voice became still stronger with the rise of OPEC. This was its one great political economic success, because OPEC was, of course, the group of oil-producing countries that decided that they could get together with each other and without asking the United States or Western European countries or Japan their opinion about these matters, could set the price of oil where they wanted to set it. Well, this was a threat to U.S. hegemony, and of course, it was a threat also to the European economies and to many other third world economies as well. The United States became quite fearful that the success of OPEC would inspire groups to form cartels around other things that were produced in the third world. Then the third world, instead of being obviously weak and just a kind of pawn for us to play with or to sort of fight over between East and West, would become itself an enormously powerful economic player on the world scene. So during the 70s, these matters came to a head, and Ronald Reagan came to office in 1980 with the determination to restore U.S. hegemony. Now, restoring U.S. hegemony, I don't mean that we'd ever lost the hegemony, I just mean it was genuinely threatened. And setting the price of oil without our permission was an act of rebellion against that hegemony that could not be tolerated. So in a way, Ronald Reagan declared war on the third world. Now, this took a number of directions. One of them was to undercut the power of the United Nations. And Reagan worked at that systematically, transferring all economic thinking and decision-making to the World Bank and the IMF, which could be much more successfully controlled by the Treasury Department of the United States. I think you know something of this history. I mean, we just refused to pay our contribution to the UN until they did what we told them to do. And we were able to show our enormous power over the United Nations through this means, not through the processes internal to the United Nations. But the United Nations came to be, well, it was already, of course, viewed with great suspicion by the conservatives in this country before that time, and this strengthens Reagan's hand in punishing it for allowing such strong voices of those who were not supportive of the United States to have a role. But by far the most effective means of dealing with the Third World was presented to Reagan. It came in such a, excuse me for this aside, but so many things happened. It's just exactly the right time for those conservatives. I begin to wonder about how Providence acts. We have a hard time finding equally propitious moments in the progressive cause in terms of this. But in any case, very shortly after Reagan came into office, Mexico threatened to declare bankruptcy. This was the Third World debt crisis. Now, this debt crisis was also partly the result of OPEC. But much more in Mexico's case, it was the result of the fact that OPEC dollars were being loaned at very favorable terms to Third World governments, and Mexico had borrowed a lot of them, some of it well used, much of it corruptly used. Often these loans were at an interest rate lower than the rate of inflation. You know, it's hard to refuse money when it's loaned to you that way. But then toward the end of the decade, inflation came in interest rates rose very rapidly. Is what I meant to say. Interest was lower than inflation, but then interest rates became much higher than inflation, and Mexico could not keep up with its debt. Well, this was the opportunity that just presented itself in a marvelous way to the Reagan administration, and Mexico, the government of Mexico, the Mexican elite was persuaded that going bankrupt was not an acceptable solution, and that the U.S. government and the World Bank and the IMF would very generously assist Mexico not to go bankrupt. And so they did bring creditors together, and they renegotiated everything, and they created a situation in which Mexico could survive without going bankrupt. That was a great success. Now, what did Mexico have to do in order to get all of this? It had to accept structural adjustment. Now, the idea of structural adjustment had already been around, but it had been a very, very minor factor prior to 1982. Structural adjustment came into being in the thinking of McNamara in the previous decade out of fairly reasonable considerations. I mean, the World Bank kept being puzzled. It poured money into countries, and it didn't seem to do a lot of good. So it kind of tracked this money, and it found out that there were structural problems in the society that kept the money from being well invested and kept the money in the hands of the elite and not getting to the poor, and so forth and so on. So the idea of lending money to a country to help it to change its basic structures and enable it to become therefore more effective in its use of money was not, in principle, a vicious idea. I don't want to suggest that it was. But structural adjustment became an instrument that could force third world countries to give up their national economies altogether. In other words, Mexico had, prior to that time, worked at the job of improving the condition of Mexico, to some extent including the poor, by its own internal Mexican policies. It wanted to keep control of its own oil, keep control of its own basic industry. It to maintain agricultural policies that had been put into place for the sake of the peasants, etc., etc. But from 1982 on, all of that was put under pressure. And Mexico made many concessions already at that time, made more concessions with NAFTA and so forth in the years since then. What is structural adjustment? It's the abandonment of those walls that enable a country to control their own economy. How does a country control its own economy? Well, standard practice, you have control over exports and imports. Tariffs, of course, are one of the main means of controlling exports and imports. You control your currency. You own your own basic productive facilities. But when I say you, some of it's by the government, some of it would be by citizens of the country. You limit investments by outsiders, so they cannot buy up all your industries. And you can then set your wages at that level that makes sense in terms of the internal functioning of the economy. And Mexico wasn't doing very well on some of these matters, but you can have environmental protections if you want to. That's all possible within a national economy. But if you give up all of that, if you give up your ability to control imports and exports, if you open up everything in your country for sale to outsiders, known as liberalization, and if you are then put in position that you can only move forward by attracting outside capital to invest in your country, then you need to make your country attractive, you have to lower wages. You also, of course, have to control people who then resist the lowering of their wages or their further impoverishment. So we had a school at Fort Benning that helped teach the troops how to engage in low-intensity warfare against those who resisted all of these kinds of policies. Not everything began in 1980. I'm sorry, I'm generalizing this too sweepingly. But structural adjustment as a major factor in the world did begin in Mexico, then spread to almost all the countries of the Third World. They were all dreadfully indebted after the 70s, and so the IMF and the World Bank could go to them and say, okay, we'll help you reorganize your economy so you don't have to go bankrupt. In exchange for that, you accept this regime. Now, this is the global economy. From my point of view, the global economy is the economy brought into the world by the application of strict neoliberal economic thinking under the Reagan administration. Now, of course, Reagan did not only declare war on the Third World and force it to integrate itself into the global economy, which was clearly controlled by the United States and a few other countries, but Reagan also had to deal with the Second World. And particularly, he was unhappy with the fact that in East Asia, these national economies had succeeded brilliantly. They had not developed under neoliberal policies at all, but by a very close relationship between government planning and industrial leaders. I'm not trying to say something very virtuous about this. I'm simply saying it's a completely different kind of economic system from the one that Reagan was interested in. But it also means as long as you have national economies that don't depend upon decisions made elsewhere, either by transnational corporations or governments, you have more potential for resistance. And it was very important, beginning in the Reagan administration, to undercut these national economies. First, of course, we tried to give them a very bad name. We talked about crony capitalism. You remember that term? I'm sure there's plenty of corruption in them. I'm not trying to whitewash anything. I'm just saying, on the whole, they worked better than our system did, and that we did not want, since I think to this day, no third world country has developed really on neoliberal principles, all the ones that had any real success developed upon the principles of national economy. But we were not interested in their actual success. We were interested in making sure that no part of the world would be free from the control of the global economy, which then became the instrument of control by the United States government. Now, Reagan was far more successful in relation to the Third World than in relationship to East Asia. But of course, East Asia was pushed, especially the countries in the South, were pushed to considerable liberalization, and that made them open to the crisis that developed in the mid-1990s, which then enabled Western capital to move in and buy up many corporations at fire sale policies, and those countries don't have the kind of freedom that they did. It's very interesting. The two Asian countries that were least affected by the crisis were the ones that wouldn't obey the IMF and the World Bank. That is, Malaysia decided it would adopt policies that would control its currency, and it came out doing very well. But the fact that the IMF and World Bank policies consistently destroy economies is not often mentioned in our press. And Malaysia has been given a bad character for having broken the rules, so to speak. China, of course, is the other country that had never come fully under IMF and World Bank control, and it weathered this crisis without a great deal of difficulty. Okay, now, my main point here is to say neoliberal economics, it has, of course, a couple of major principles with respect to the issues we are raising now. First, it means free trade. Nice sounding word. It means that wherever you are in the world, you do not, as a nation or as a people, control your own economies. Everything depends upon what the market will accept from you, and therefore the market, which is of course controlled in certain ways by others, determines what you will do. So free trade, and of course free trade also means openness to allowing other countries to buy up what you have. And then, because quite a bit of the third world economies were government controlled directly, owned in many cases, liberalization meant putting all government properties into the market. So there would be more and more for outsiders to buy up. And this has been pushed a long way. Okay, so free trade weakened the East Asian economies. It destroyed the third world economies. I don't think that term is too strong. The most extreme case perhaps is Argentina, but where the paper economy is simply totally gone because it was so obedient to the IMF. It even, it was the poster boy because they not only did everything the IMF required, but they went beyond the IMF requirements. And the result is total disaster so far as Argentina is concerned. So the application of neoliberal economic principles to the third world and then to East Asia have been very powerful and very effective. I say more in relation to the third world, but still quite significant. In relation to Europe, obviously, it's not quite the same thing. But the more we have a global economy, the more difficult it is for Europe to maintain the very high level of welfare state or democratic socialism which it had attained. They now have to either have very high unemployment or else greatly lower wages. Now, all of this also applies to inside the United States. By the time Reagan came along, he was no longer so fearful of generating Marxist backlash. The well-paying jobs in the United States no longer exist in the United States and work elsewhere. So from 1980 on, while the gross national product and corporate earnings and CEO salaries have soared, people in the bottom half of the economy have actually lost ground. It's not an accident. The system was guaranteed to have that kind of effect. It's the effect that was wanted. I believe that Reagan wanted to undo the New Deal, and to a large extent, that project is still in force. The main feature of the New Deal that he didn't dare to attack is Social Security. So it's taken a little while, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future. It looked like for a while we would begin a process of privatizing it. Now I think that has to be delayed a little while. But obviously we know what direction our leaders would like to go with respect to this remnant of New Deal policy. Okay, now, the U.S. is thus opposed to the development. First, it needs to have a society which is more fully controlled by an elite than was the society in this country prior to the Reagan administration. And it has been working in that direction very successfully. And then it needs to avoid having any centers of competing power. Now, David was talking more about political military power. I'm talking more about economic power. I think both are probably equally important. The undermining of the strength of the powerful, say, Europe and East Asia goes more slowly. The Third World and its direct protest against us, because it was far more confrontational than we are, has gone more slowly. Has gone very rapidly, so that problem is no longer a serious one for us. Now, of course, the next step had to do with the Soviet Union itself. Perhaps I'm putting these things in poor sequence. And I think we have to acknowledge the brilliance of the Reagan administration. If we measure the greatness of a president by the effective changes made, both in the nation and in the world, I would say Reagan is our greatest president. I happen not to like the directions he moved us, so great has a kind of value connotation that I oppose. But when you learn about all these emperors and empresses in the past who have been called great and discover that they were great because they oppressed everybody very successfully and conquered other people and destroyed them by the millions, then we realize great has that meaning of enormous power, actual effectiveness, success in moving ahead in a direction. So I believe that Reagan made massive changes in the culture of this country, in the political power structures of this country, and the ideals of this country, and in the distribution of wealth and power within the country, and actually had enormous effect upon what went on in the rest of the world. And no Democrat, well, we haven't had a lot, but Democratic presidents have not seriously tried to reverse the changes that Reagan instituted. They may slow them down, moderate them in some ways. But basically, it is not just the Republican Party that is implementing the Reagan Revolution, but both parties. The imperialist direction, by which I here simply mean controlling the economy of the world, largely through economic means, but of course always with the threat of military power where there is resistance, has proven extremely successful. Now, the main issue has then been, to what extent do we implement our imperial ambitions unilaterally, and to what extent do we make use of multilateral organizations? And obviously, the use of multilateral organizations at least obscures the imperial character of what's being done more than unilateral action. And it is this shift to almost complete unilateral action that has exposed what's going on at a deeper level, and for which I was expressing some appreciation. The Clinton administration, part, of course, of this whole direction has to do with the creation of the World Trade Organization, Part of it had to do with NAFTA, a great deal had to do with the free trade agreement of the Americas, and Clinton pushed this agenda just as strongly as Reagan did. But all of that still has a kind of multilateral character. You are getting agreements among countries and then creating some kind of international institution to implement what has been agreed upon, or using the international institution to generate the agreement in the first place. So though I think he was not above or below, or whatever you want to say, unilateral action when that was needed, he was more favorable to operating in this indirect way. Now, Reagan was mixed at this point. I mean, I think his great weakening of the United Nations made it possible after that for the United States to sort of return to operate within the United Nations, and the success of Bush in getting the United Nations to support the war against Iraq at that point would be an example of how the United Nations can be used by the United States government to cover and implement its policies. The World Trade Organization is a particularly interesting phenomenon in this respect because it was opposed, or something like it was opposed by the United States at the time of the Bretton Woods meetings. See, there was at one time the view that the Bretton Woods meetings should, in addition to producing the World Bank and the IMF, should also produce what was then talked about as the International Trade Organization. But at that time, the United States thought it would do better to just handle things on a unilateral basis with respect to trade, rather than to have an international organization that might set up some rules that would inhibit American action in some respects. But as time went by, the United States decided that the situation was a bit too chaotic, and it worked through the whole series of general agreements on tariffs and trade to push its particular agenda. Now, this agenda, of course, as applied through the World Trade Organization, or through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which then became the World Trade Organization, was very similar to what was being done by structural adjustment. It required that countries liberalize, reduce tariff barriers, and any kind of impediment to trade. And the United States then began focusing upon those features of other countries which it would most like to buy up or to at least compete with. Many countries, for a long time, as part of their national economies, kept their banking institutions basically national. They discouraged foreign banks from coming in and competing with their banks. For one thing, if this is a small country, the foreign bank would have huge capital resources that it could draw on, and it could put the local banks out of business. But for another, relations between governments and banks have a lot to do with the whole monetary fiscal policies of nations. And if a government loses the power to interact with its banks in this kind of way, it really is at the mercy of outsiders to determine everything. So the U.S. pushed very hard that banking interests would be liberalized and made available for competition and purchase by the United States and, of course, other Western powers. Well, they're also very interested in having agreements that would prevent countries from violating patents of other countries. As we've read a lot about that in the pharmaceutical area, that if third world countries have to buy drugs from us, the price is very high. And the drug companies say the reason it's high is because we spent a huge amount of money in the development of this, and now it's not worth it to develop new drugs unless we can make a profit from the old drugs. I mean, there's a plausible argument, but when this means that drugs needed for life itself in third world countries, and which could easily be produced there and made available cheaply to the people, are not available to them, obviously there is resistance. But the United States pushed matters of this sort very hard through through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was the kind of thing that'd be much more difficult to do if you didn't have an international organization that all these countries belong to. So more and more the U.S. shifted from being opposed to an international organization to regulate trade to supporting it and pushing it hard, and of course the WTO was the result of that. Now, quite ironically, the U.S. may have decided that it wants to give up the WTO and go back to the unilateral. My own reading of Cancun is that the U.S. decided it wasn't worth making any compromises in order to keep the WTO going, so we would just go ahead, and if we couldn't get our whole agenda with no compromises accepted, let the WTO go. And we would pick up by unilateral relationships to smaller and weaker countries, we would be able to make them obey us, whereas when they all got together and agreed not to go along with what we were requesting unless we did something about the subsidies, that brought a kind of limit to our power that we were not willing to accept. I'm sure you know that, again, economic power and imperial power are very closely related to each other in relationship to subsidies of agriculture. One of the distortions that no economist would approve of. So this is not a case of the application of neoliberal principles, but simply of U.S. self-interest, has been that in structural adjustment we have forced other countries to give up the subsidization of their agriculture. And then we have exported to them food at a price that their farmers cannot compete with. Now, of course, if our agriculture were not subsidized, you might say, well, this follows standard economic principles. We have a level playing field, and you buy wherever you can get it cheapest. But to claim that we are better farmers, and therefore we produce food more cheaply and can undercut, has, of course, no basics in fact at all. I've heard Dean Freudenberger say, or perhaps it was Wes Jackson, that the total subsidies to agriculture in this country and the total profits from agriculture in this country are almost exactly the same. So there's no profit from actually producing the food. The profit comes simply when the U.S. government subsidizes it. So I suppose one of the stories that I find most painful is in relation to Haiti, and of course Haiti being in the Western Hemisphere, any resistance to our hegemony of any kind is peculiarly resented. The Haitian government was forced to give up its subsidies to the rice farmers, and then we exported rice from the Bay Area, and we could sell that rice more cheaply than the farmers could produce it. In a country where something like 80% of the people are rice farmers, the economic consequences are, of course, unthinkable. Now, I'm saying this is the sort of thing which clearly represents imperial interests closely connected with commercial interests, rather than the goal of implementing a level playing field as the neoliberal economic theory would advocate. Well, in 2001, a new development emerged, and we all know about that. September 11th provided an occasion at which issues that were probably highly debated within our administration prior to that time were settled in a particular direction. Now, this carries matters another step. I think we always have to look both at the internal and the external dimensions. One of the necessities for an effective empire is control of one's own people. And although the Reagan Revolution had already impoverished a lot of people and concentrated wealth much more strongly in the hands of a small percentage of the population, it had not directly attacked our civil liberties in any massive way. But there were people in the government before this time who certainly wanted to reduce our ability to protest government actions. It's more difficult to build an empire abroad if you have massive protests at home against what you're doing. Oh, I think that much of what's in the Patriot Act is more directed to providing a context in which civil disobedience and protest can be, people can become frightened about engaging in them because of the consequences, or may actually be punished if they do take part. I think it has more to do with that than it does with anything that could really be called security. I'm not saying it has nothing to do with security, but it was an opportunity, as David pointed out, to implement a step that would make it much easier for a U.S. government to act without the support of masses of its people than would be possible without that. With respect to other matters, it was the occasion for deciding clearly that unilateral action would supersede multilateral. It's because of that that I think that it's very likely that the U.S. didn't much care whether the WTO survived or not. Probably doesn't care a great deal whether the World Bank and the IMF survive, except as the implementers of structural adjustment policies. That's the function that is important to the U.S., and it works much better to have a multilateral organization imposing those things than the U.S. trying to do it on a case-by-case basis in a direct way. So that the realization that we no longer care whether others approve of our actions or support our actions. If they are in our interest, we will take them anyway. That came as a really startling new development. We talked about the question of whether this is a sustainable policy. Now, again, one reason I hate what's happened, but I'm not unhappy that it's happened, is that I don't think it's a sustainable policy. I think our administration is already recognizing that it is not economically sustainable, and that, of course, is what I'm going to focus on rather than the other elements in the question of sustainability. We cannot simply continue to tax less and spend much more and indefinitely continue to expect the rest of the world to pay our bills. Now, there are two ways that the rest of the world has been paying our bills. One of them, they give us a few $100 million or a few $1 billion here and there to cover the costs of a war. Well, that's been very helpful, but if we enter the war unilaterally without the support of the United Nations, it's less likely that very many countries are going to cough up the billions that are needed in order to pay for the war. They're still helping in Afghanistan, but the Iraq situation is embarrassing to us because we are now having to make all kinds of concessions if we want UN approval, and without UN approval, we won't get the money. I think money is still going to be extremely important. In other words, I have come to recognize that the imperial is just as important as the economic, so that economic power has been as much in the service of empire as empire has been in the service of the economy, which was the emphasis I previously had. But nevertheless, the two are inextricably tied together, and if we cannot finance what we're doing, we're going to be in trouble. The first point is we're going to have to pay for these things ourselves if we do them on our own, and we don't want to pay for it. Second is, if we go further and further and further into debt, Europeans and Japanese and third world elites are going to become less enthusiastic about buying our bonds and investing in our stock market. I mean, the economy of the United States will not continue to look very stable if the debt rises higher and higher. And the only way we have been able to pay our debts in the past, based upon the fact of very unequal balance of trade, is that the country that we send our dollars to in order to pay for the goods invests them in U.S. bonds or in the U.S. stock market or U.S. real estate or something of that sort. Otherwise, we would have been in acute trouble a long time ago. I don't think we can count on that continuing indefinitely. So I believe that on strictly economic grounds, we have come to a point of, with our unilateralism, of overreach. Now, if we succeed in displacing Bush and get a Democratic president who will go back to multilateralism, empire may continue much longer. Excuse me for these ironic comments, but I think we need to recognize that the goal of the Democrats is not different from the goal of the Republicans. Their methods are, in fact, more sophisticated and, in the long run, more sustainable. I will tomorrow speak of not just this hope that I have mentioned last, but of other reasons to detect in what is happening in the world a shift that will make it more and more difficult for our American empire to continue to extend itself, and that perhaps the emergence of a rather different order is possible. I'm very interested in the question of possibility because while I've been talking about a very different kind of order for a long time, I see that the vast majority of people who hear me just sort of say, well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But obviously, the world is destined to go in a more and more integrated direction, and there's no hope for any other kind of future. I believe that some disintegration is already in the process of taking place, and that it is not mere wishful thinking and sheer, what shall I say, romanticism to talk about another world is possible. Thank you. Yes, please.
Speaking of irony, I would like to remark on the irony that Chalmers Johnson points out woven in the contradiction between our economic policy and our imperial political policy with respect to Japan.
Yes.
We were so keen on making Japan an example
Yes.
of the rest of the world vis-a-vis communism and the Soviets that we gave it unparalleled access to our markets and in the process hollowed out our economies.
Yes.
Created here this flight of jobs to overseas.
Okay. Well, what we would need to say, the flight of jobs was never, to repeat that, yes. He's pointing out that Chalmers, is it Chalmers? Yeah. Has pointed out that there's a contradiction built into our policy toward Japan. Well, on the one hand, we were building it up for imperial reasons. At the same time, we were actually engaging in a relationship to Japan which led to the great weakening of the U.S. economy. And you suggested it led to the flight of jobs. Now, of course, there was no flight of jobs to Japan in the way there has been the flight of jobs to China and Southeast Asia and Mexico. So I think the flight of jobs began later. It was really, but of course it does mean that if we are importing more than we are exporting, that there is an indirect flight of jobs. The jobs, so you're not wrong, but the term flight of jobs I associate with the other policy. Yes, I think that's a very good point. The reason the U.S. did not try to weaken the nationalist economies of Asia earlier and more vigorously, I think, is that they were so important as long as we thought China was the threat and we needed to have a first line of defense against China, and we needed those to be economically successful countries that would create discontent within China because of their visibility and so forth. So that is an important point. And in my talking about the relation of the imperial and the economic, I think that's quite true. It seems to me that then after 1980, things became much more extreme in that respect. And we decided that it was all right for the production by American companies. I mean, that was the production by Japanese companies was making an impact on U.S. production. Then it became a matter of production by American companies would be more profitable and would produce goods that were more competitive on the global market and would also undersell goods produced in the United States if the labor took place in Mexico, Central America, and then later, of course, China became the huge source for all of that. And I was told again and again as I was distressed by these matters some time ago, but then this was going to be so good for the poor in other countries. Many, many idealists were supportive of this whole system for that reason. Well, we've had long enough, at least with NAFTA and Mexico, to know that it has not been good for Mexican peasants. It has not been good for Mexican workers. Their wages are less than they were before NAFTA came into effect. The peasants are being driven off the land at a fairly rapid rate. But there are, 10 times as many billionaires in Mexico now as there were before? So it's both the inequality within the country and the inequality among countries that is increased, and the increase has been accelerated by the Reagan Revolution. Some of it was going on before then. Yes?
Concerning the European Union,
Yes.
what kind of play do you think that they will have in this whole global economy versus the United States? You know, we have seen a breach already with the United States when it came to Iraq concerning France and Germany.
Yes.
Will the European Union slow this pace as far as the United States is concerned? Will it attempt to take over what the United States is doing? Or will we leave the unilateral and just go back to the multilateral?
I think that he was asking what's going to happen between Europe and the United States, and will Europe begin to rise in power in relation to the United States, or will we go back to a multilateral relationship where this tension is reduced? I think if we get a Democrat in office, we'll go back more to the multilateral. I think it's difficult for Bush to go back to the multilateral effectively after all the things that he has done and said. So I think that depends a lot on the next election. Europe is, again, you read so many things. Which of them are correct, I don't know. But one thing I read that I wondered if it might be right is that one of the unspoken of, rarely spoken of reasons for destroying the government of Iraq was that the Iraqi government had decided to go with the euro rather than the dollar. And that if Iraq did that, very likely other countries would begin to do that. And one of the most important ways in which we exercise hegemony in the economic sphere is that the dollar is the world's currency. So if you're asking, is Europe trying to prepare itself to rival us? I think one of the motives of producing the euro is to challenge the dollar. And I don't think it's impossible that one of these days the East Asian countries would produce something that could play that role. So these are among the things that I see as possibilities within the economic sphere of the undercutting of U.S. economic imperialism. And I believe if that is cut, it will be very difficult for us to maintain an imperialism by military force alone. Not that we won't have the weapons that could wipe anybody out we want to destroy, but I think there's some limit to the percentage of the global population that we would be prepared to wipe out that way, even for all kinds of reasons. So anyway, my hope is for economic collapse, and I think that's the least painful. I think that what has happened in Argentina could happen in the United States. And I think that might save the world. It wouldn't be nice for me. Yes. Yes. I think if we elect a Democrat, that process will be drawn out. If the Republicans seem so hell-bent on tax reduction and increasing spending that I think they're taking us to the precipice with great rapidity. Yes. Theology, okay? Yeah. Well, obviously, since we put on this conference, we think it is important. Now, it's always risky to say the context. And you see, I would have said a few years ago, the economics should be the context. And I've been trying to focus on that. And now I'm trying to qualify that. Now, I mean, I don't think this is a huge jump. I think the economy is very, very important for imperialism, and imperialism is very important for but nevertheless, I fully agree with you. But I do want to say, David and I have just come back from a conference at Drew Theological Seminary on the subject of American empire. Now, it was put on by a Claremont graduate who is a process theologian. So it may not be altogether accidental. But yes, I think process theology, although it's been very interested in ethnic theologies and all these things you were speaking of, is, what should I say, inherently more inclusive or universal in its scope, so that a topic like this more naturally falls into our interest than into that of a good many other theologies. But I think that, I mean, the conference at Drew had many more speakers. I mean, it was a much bigger affair, and there were theologians there from a good many different places, and they were not all process theologians. So I do think it's catching on as an important topic. But thank you. I feel like you're approving of our having a conference on the topic. I understand. Yeah, but this conference is not just about the economic aspect. Yes, I emphasize that, but not everybody emphasizes that. Yes. Oh, why did Tony Blair lead Britain to go with us? And obviously, I don't know. One can suggest several reasons. One, Tony Blair and other British leaders have been cultivating the special relationship to the United States. And let's suppose you were a leader in Britain and you were convinced that U.S. imperialism is here to stay. You can either then join people in resistance to it, which you may think is futile, it's going to succeed anyway, or you may seek to be the favored ally of it. So that would be one reason. Now, another possibility, and let's recognize in each of the individual things that we do, you can give a lot of positive reasons. I mean, Saddam was a monster, is a monster. We haven't found him yet, so I guess he's still alive. And getting rid of Saddam has an idealistic character to it. And people can be attracted to this kind of venture of replacing tyrants with more democratic governments without cynical means. I mean, I think motives are very, very varied. And Blair may have genuinely believed that this was an important step. Also, if it were true that Iraq might pose a threat, an increasing threat as time went on, then to knock it out before that threat became serious has a kind of plausibility in international political thinking. You know, you want to do it in the least bloody way possible, and of course at the least cost to yourself, and so forth. So some of those arguments that were put forward may have been honest. Now, another obvious possibility is that those who have allied themselves with the U.S. will come out with more control of the oil of Iraq than those who have been opposed. And obviously, oil is important to Great Britain. I don't know. So please don't think I have told you what his motives were. I'm just saying I don't think it's hard to understand why he might make the decision this was in the interest of Great Britain and perhaps in the interest of the Iraqi people too. Time, yes.